The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
Despite this statement by the previous US Fed, Alan Greenspan, the US is unlikely to just print money and pay off its debt completely. Why? For one, while it can actually print unlimited amount of money, there can be some serious consequences. But then there is also an argument that the USA simply does not need to pay off its debt completely ever. Of course, you and I can't do that. We must pay our debt or face consequences like default and bankruptcy. But the US government is different from an individual or even a company.
Could there be any risks and consequences of the US government defaulting on its bonds?
No. So what do Warren Buffett and Alan Greenspan know and understand? Let's discuss in this video. And the most interesting part, if America were to decide to even pay off all its debt tomorrow, the whole world would get together and beg the US to not do that. You don't believe me? Watch this video till the end and then you'll know why they will do exactly that. The world and the economic system as we know it won't even exist if the US were to completely pay off its debt. America's national debt has reached $33 trillion and continues to climb. This means that each of us roughly own about $100,000 to the creditors of the country. There is an easy solution to this. What am I missing? Chapter 1. Print more money to pay off this debt. Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan made that famous statement in 2011 that we saw at the beginning of the video. The United States can pay any debt because we can essentially print money to do that. And he's correct. US has a unique advantage that is not available to any country in the world. It borrows in its own currency, the US dollar. So theoretically, it can never run out of money to pay its own debt obligations. It literally owns the machines for printing those dollars. Any other country does not have this advantage. For example, if Argentina wants to pay back its loans to the IMF, it needs US dollars. It cannot pay back the debt in its local currency. That's wonderful. Then the US should just print the $33 billion and wipe off the debt completely. Well, it could, but it won't. So technically, the job of printing money or dollars belongs to the Federal Reserve or the Fed. It is the central bank of the US that is technically independent from the government. Now, the Fed's mandate is to manage a stable growth in the economy. The right way to do it is to increase the money supply in roughly the same proportion as the growth in economic activity. But if the money supply is increased at a much faster pace than the economic activity growth, it would lead to too much money leading too few goods and services. And you know what that means? Inflation. Now, during COVID times, the Fed had to actually increase the money supply by trillions. And we have seen what has that done to inflation around the country. 3 years after COVID, inflation is still above 6% most of the month.
For most of 2022, inflation lingered above 8%, a 40-year high. It's affected everything from gas prices to groceries.
Now imagine if Fed suddenly decide to print another $33 trillion. The US and frankly the world would likely see hyperinflation. The US dollar would become nearly worthless. And hyperinflation isn't just a scary story. It has happened repeatedly throughout the history. In 1923 Germany, hyperinflation became so bad that the workers had to be paid multiple times during the day so that they can buy their groceries before the prices went up. And in 2018 Venezuela, a 5-pound chicken cost roughly 14.6 billion bolivars. This is equivalent to just $2.
This is an example of the inflation rates in Venezuela. All of this money is barely $4.
In 2008 Zimbabwe, the teachers were earning trillions of dollars in pay, but a single loaf of bread was costing hundreds of billions of dollars. Zimbabwean dollars, that is. So because of this worry about inflation and the dollar potentially losing all its value, US won't really be able to print this money and pay off its debt. But there is another very powerful reason about why it would never pay the debt fully. It simply doesn't need to. Yes, it's very interesting. And I'll explain in a moment why it doesn't need to pay off its debt fully, and it's likely never will. But before that, let's quickly understand what really is the government debt and how it is similar yet very different to the household debt that you and I have. Chapter 2. What really is the national debt? You can be handling your finances like a pro, but one day life may throw you a curveball. Your expenses start to surpass your income, and before you know it, you are swiping your credit card like there is no tomorrow. Now, do you see that growing balance on your credit card, which keeps on growing? That's a lot like what happens with national debt. Every year, the federal government, like a big financial machine, crunches its number. It's a bit like the budgeting that you may be doing. The The government's income is the money that it collects through taxes. If the government spends more money on things like infrastructure, roads, bridges, healthcare, and even paying government salaries, then it's technically in the red. This budget deficit creates the need for borrowing. So to manage this deficit, Uncle Sam will not call a bank or a loan shark. Instead, the US Treasury will spring into action. They issue something called marketable securities. Think of them as simple IOUs or bonds. Individuals as well as institutions and even governments buy these bonds and give money to the government. Now here is where it gets interesting. When the government keeps on experiencing deficits every year, the national debt keeps on increasing. Very similar to you using the credit card again and again and the balance growing. Over the past century, the US debt has grown from a few $billion to $33 trillion. Of course, trillions has a lot of zeros. But why do we even need this debt? You might just wonder, why doesn't the government just tighten its belt and spend less? Well, it's not always that simple. The government must provide some important programs and services, from ensuring justice to keeping the peace, promoting general welfare, just like the Constitution prescribes for the government. Whenever tax revenues dip, and they can be for various reasons like war, pandemic, recession, government needs some financial buffer to keep these essential services going. But borrowing money isn't free. Just like you pay interest on a credit card, the government has to pay interest on the money that it borrows. In fact, in 2023, the interest component alone on the national debt is about $320 billion. That's 5.3% of the federal budget. When overall interest rates were low, that was manageable. But with the interest rising, it becomes difficult for the government. It's same as the interest rate rising on your credit card. Same is happening with our national debt. So can the government continue to borrow unlimited amount of money? While it can, there is a little twist. The Congress has imposed a debt ceiling. It's a cap on how much the government can borrow. If we hit that ceiling, things start getting complicated. The government can't pay its bill and could default. That's a big no-no and could wreak havoc on the financial markets and the economy. The national debt is a priority for Americans across the political spectrum. Over 3/4 of the voters believe that addressing national debt should be one of the top 3 priorities. That includes 72% of Democrats, 74% of independents, and 86% of Republicans. Concerns about the ever-increasing US debt leads to questions around how our future generation, like our children and grandchildren, will ever manage to pay this colossal debt. But here's the simple truth. The future generation may not have to pay the full debt. Chapter 3. Why the USA may never have to pay the full debt. It simply won't. See, unlike a household, the US doesn't have to settle all its financial dues before it ceases to exist or dies. In fact, the government would potentially never cease to exist. Of course, barring exceptional circumstances. So the government can perpetually roll over its debts. This is a point that is often overlooked. The biggest proponent of this theory is Paul Krugman, a top economist. He thinks that the government finances should never be compared with the household finances. As an individual, we generally earn for a fixed amount of time and then we stop earning and live for some more time and then eventually die. So for humans, debt needs to be repaid within a reasonable time. 2 years, 5 years, or even 30 years for a mortgage, but a fixed time. But unlike people, governments don't die. In fact, they likely gain more revenue with each passing generation. Though the debt to GDP ratio hovered around 97% last year, the interest payment on that is only about $395 billion, a very smaller portion of the GDP. And it has helped that the US government revenue has been growing. So according to Paul Krugman, governments must service their debt, pay interest and repay principal when the bonds become due. But they don't necessarily have to pay them off. And when the time comes to pay principal, they can just reissue new bonds to pay off the principal from the old bonds. They can even borrow to pay the interest on the previous bonds. They just need to be careful that the overall debt should not rise too much faster than the increase in revenue. And Warren Buffett agrees. In fact, this is what Warren Buffett predicted. What he means is that the country is going to grow in terms of its debt paying capacity. When the debt comes down a little bit, the country is just simply going to print more money and debt. And as long as the US borrows in its own currency, there is very low risk to our ability to service that debt. So there is no reason for the government to not leverage this easy source of money that is only available to one government in the world, the government of the USA. Remember, I said at the beginning of the video that the world simply cannot live without the American debt. Imagine for a second this scenario, that the US somehow managed to pay off its entire debt. That would mean no more US Treasury bonds available in the financial market to anyone. And that's actually a very big deal. The US Treasury bonds are seen as solid and safe investment vehicles. That's where banks, governments, and everyone else parks their money when they need safe investments. Mortgages and loans rate are set around the rates offered by these treasury bonds. Their stability is what makes dollars world's biggest reserve currency. Paying off the debt completely would mean pulling off those bonds from the market completely. The result would be chaos everywhere. And as things stand today, there is no alternative investment or currency in the world that everyone around the world would trust as they trust a US Treasury bonds. So the US Treasury bond or the US debt is actually indispensable to the world. America has control over its own currency. The concern is not running short of dollars, but printing them way too much and devaluing them way too much. That can certainly happen. Like eating too much or working too hard can be detrimental to your health. But that doesn't mean you should stop eating or quit doing any work at all. If you enjoyed this video, check out this other video about chances of China demanding payment on all the US debt that it holds. I would also appreciate if you give a like to this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.